Alright, welcome back. So in this lecture we're going to set up the Bush Harvestable and give our character the ability to pick berries from different bushes on the ground. So let's go ahead and get started. So go to your blueprints, and in our BP first person character, what we're going to do up here at the top is we're going to kind of organize things a little bit. So the very first thing that we want to add here is a E key. So search for the E, and then basically this is going to be our key to pick up items on the ground. So below it we want to add custom event and name this to interact on server. Set this to a run on server. So I want to do all the checks to check and see if there's a bush on the ground right next to us on the server, and then we can go ahead and off the press we just call our interact on server and just put a comment over this for now. Let's go name this interact and just expand this out a little bit. I want to take this little harvest item on server and move it all the way up here. So we'll just keep it all with our little harvesting logic. We can kind of keep things a little bit organized. So in our interact on server, we want to add custom event and name this to overlap ground items. Set that to run on server. And so in our interact on server, we're just going to call our overlap ground items. So later on, we're going to add more logic inside of this interact on server. So that's why we created two different events there, because later on we're going to add some logic to interact with things like a crafting bench or a storage box and things like that. So now down here we want to implement our overlap ground items. So we want to do a sphere overlap actors, and for the position we want to right click and get actor location. So get the location of the character. For the radius we're going to set this to 70. For the object types, drag off here and do a make array. And what we'll do is we'll set this to world static for now. Actors to ignore, we want to make array. And then ignore, drag off here, get reference to self. So we want to ignore our self when we do our little overlap. And then what we can do is we can drag off here and do a draw debug sphere. That way you guys can see how this looks. So hook up the actor location for the center. The radius will be the same, set to 70. And the line color, we can just set this to red. And duration 3 seconds. Thickness, we can just set this at 2. And then for now, off of our return value, we can do a branch. So off of the true, we can do a print string and name this to we hit a bush, and then copy paste this. With a false, we can just name this to a no hit. Okay, so compile, save that. So let's go ahead and set up a bush actor that we can test and see if we hit it or if we didn't hit it. So in our blueprints harvesting system, child classes, I'm going to right click in here and create a new folder for ground item classes. So the large item classes is for things like, palm trees, rocks, all that stuff, and the ground item classes are just things on the ground that you can collect. So you could add, things like pebbles if you wanted to, but we're just going to be using bushes. So in our harvesting system, we already made this ground item master, and all this is a child of our harvesting master. So open up our ground item master and click open full blueprint editor. So in here, what we need to do is go ahead and just delete all these events. I'll save that. And in the viewports, we can add a static mesh. So this will be for our bush. We need to add a variable for the health. Name this health. Change this to a float. We can set the default value to maybe 50. And so we're going to need a bush mesh. And we're also going to need to set up an interface for this class. Let's go ahead and get first a bush 3D model. So if you open up Quixel Bridge, Quixel Bridge also has 3D plants. So if you click the 3D plants here, you're going to see there's different collections. And I believe all you can do is just search for tropical. Better if you search for tropical palm. Should have this tropical palm 3D mesh. So go ahead and download this, and once it's finished downloading, we'll go ahead and click the add button, so we'll add it to our project and just verify that it added it here. So we have this little palm bush mesh, and so we can go ahead and add that in for our ground item master. So select the static mesh, select this tropical palm, and set it just like so. We might need to play around with the material to make it a little bit more green, but for now that should do. The next thing that we need to do is create a interface for this. So the same sort of setup for our large item master, where we created health and then we have a BPI large item interface. So we need to do the same thing for our ground item master. So in our blueprints interfaces, go ahead and right click and create a new blueprint interface. Name this to BPI underscore ground item, and double click and open this up. And for the function here, we'll just name this to get ground item ref and add a single output and change this to a BP underscore ground item master object reference, and just rename this to ref. Compile, save that, and then in our ground item master, we'll go to the class settings, and under the interfaces, we'll click add and search for our BPI underscore ground item. Compile, save that. So now we have in our interfaces our get ground item ref. So double click on that, and for the ref here, we'll just drag off and do get reference to self. So compile, save that. So we set up our interface now. We set up our health. We set up our static mesh. So this is all good to go. Let's go ahead and close this ground item master. And in our harvesting system, let's go ahead and right click this ground item master and create a child blueprint class. And just name this to BP underscore tropical bush 01. And then move this to our child classes. And move this to our ground item classes folder. And we can right click, create a new folder, and name this tropical bushes, and move the tropical bush into that folder. So we can go ahead and drag this into our scene. And so next we just need to test our collision settings. So let's go up to our BP ground item master and select our static mesh. And so this is set to block all dynamic, and in our character we're only overlapping with world static. So in our ground master item, select the static mesh, set this to custom, set the object type to world static, And we want to make sure that the pawn can overlap with this, okay? Otherwise, we're not going to be able to walk through this bush. So that should save it to this child class, the BP Tropical Bush. So let's go ahead and hit play and test this out. So we run up to here and press E. Okay, so it says no hit. So you can see the sphere that gets generated when we press E to interact. So it looks like we need to mess around with the collision settings. So I believe there can be an issue if this plant doesn't have any collision. So this actual static mesh. So if we scroll down and go to our Megascans, 3 plants, tropical palm, I believe we have this tropical palm, variation 1. This mesh needs to have some collision to it, okay? So that when we do our little overlap, our sphere overlap trace, we want to make sure that we actually hit it. So under the collision, we can add a sphere simplified collision. And you can select this and click R so that we get a little scale gizmo. We just scale this down a little bit and just save that. So now what we should be able to do is we should be able to, our trace should hit the bush, but our players should also be able to overlap and not get stuck on it. So if I hit play here, let's go ahead and test this out. Press E. So now you can see we hit a bush. And if I run over here, it says no hit. If I go into the bush and press E, it says we hit a bush. Okay? So now we have our collision and our trace set up. So now what we want to go ahead and do is set up the harvesting logic so that we can add the proper resources that we need to our character's inventory. So let's go ahead and create a new function inside of our character. We want to name this to harvest ground item. And this will have one input. We'll change this to the type actor object actor at the very bottom, and then set this to object reference and name this to ref. Compile, save. And then off of here, what we can do is get ground item. We have our interface message. So then we want to do the same sort of setup that we did in our hatchet class, where we subtract the health from the ground item or from the bush, and then we get from a data table what items we should receive and what items we should add to our inventory. So we need to go ahead and get health. So this is the health of the ground item, which is the bush, and do a subtract. And then we'll set the damage to 15. And what we'll do is off of this, we'll set this, promote this to a local variable, name this to local health, and hook this up. And then we can go ahead and get our local health and do a less than or equal to check. And off of here we can do a branch. So we're going to check and see if our health is less than or equal to 0, because if the health of the ground item is less than or equal to 0, that means that we need to spawn in that destructible class and destroy the bush, basically. So then off of the false here, we can get off our rep and set health. So if it is not less than 0, we can set our health to the local health, which is just, the health minus 15. And then what we want to do is we want to get a data table for our ground items. Technically, you could use the same data table, but I'm just going to keep it separate. That way, we could have a separate data table for only ground items. So in our data tables, you can right click, add under the miscellaneous, data table and add our s underscore large item. Click OK. And then name this to dt underscore ground resources. And double click and open this up. So click add a new row in the data table. So for our row name, we need to match this BP underscore tropical bush 01. So name this to BP underscore tropical bush 01. Then you need to do underscore C for class. So we can add our destructible class here, which we'll need to make. And then we also need to add a given item. So let's go ahead and add a new item that will be like a berry. So in our data tables, open up our items. Go ahead and add a new item. Change a row to 6. Item ID to 6. For the item icon, type in text underscore herbs. Then you should see this text underscore herbs 05 underscore B. So it kind of looks like this little blueberry. Select that. The item name, we'll just name this to berries. Item description, consume these berries to restore food. It'll be common. Scroll down, is stackable. Set the stack size to 100, and that should be good. You could also add an additional item and add like a leaf that you get from harvesting the bush. So I'm going to add another item, item ID 7, quantity 1, and for the texture we'll search for text underscore herbs, and we have this little leaf here. I'm just going to name the name to tropical leaf. And item description, used to craft rope and other useful items. Okay, so you can get creative and add your own different raw resources that you'll get from harvesting different plants or rocks or whatever, because these are the base raw resources that you're going to use to craft more advanced items like a bow or a spear or something like that. So again, you can get creative with the different item types that you add, but for now this will work. So is stackable, set that to true. Set the stack size to 100, and of course make sure that it's set to a resource. So we have those two items, so item ID 6 and 7. So in our ground resources now, for our bush we can add 2 given items. First one will be 6, our berries. And for our quantity we could add, say, 3 berries. You can ignore the preferred tool type, we're not going to be using that for harvesting berries. Next one we'll add 7 for our tropical leaf. And I'm just going to set the quantity to 1. So save that. So now in our first person character, in our harvest ground item function, we can drag off here and do a get data table row. For the data table, we need to select our ground resources. For the row name, we need to use our class name. So off of here, we want to do a get class and then convert get class display name. And then we just need to convert this to a row name. So drag this onto the row name and we'll convert this string into a row name for our data table. And then off of here we need to go ahead and break s large item. For our given items, we'll go ahead and drag and promote that to a local variable and name that to given resources. Hook that up for the row found, and then we need to get our given resources and do a for each loop. And then off of our array element we can do a break. So we'll get the resource ID, the quantity, and again this preferred tool type we're not going to use inside of here. And so here we need to do a little calculation, and it's going to be a lot more simple since we're not using different tools or anything, we're just going to use the base quantity times a random float. That way we can get sort of a random amount of berries or resources every time we pick them. So we need to go ahead and right click and add math expression. And for this, we're going to add parentheses, base variable times rate variable, parentheses, and then times that by random variable. Okay. So we have our base variable. So for our quantity, we'll take this and convert this to our base, to convert it to a float. For our rates, this will be like our server rates. So just set this for now to 1. Our random variable, what we'll do is drag over here and do a get random or a random float in range. So for the float, we'll do a minimum of 0.3, a maximum of 1.2. Compile, save that. Then off of the return value, we can just do a truncate. That way we can round it down to a integer. And then promote this to a local variable. We'll name this to a local quantity. And hook up the execution pin to the loop body. Then before we add it to our inventory, we need to check and see if this local quantity is less than 0, is less than or equal to 0, because if it is, then we don't want to add it. So get our local quantity and do is less or equal to 0, to a branch. So if it is less than or equal to 0, we don't want to do anything. But if it is, we can call our harvest item on server. So harvest item on server. And then for the resource, we can drag off here and do a make s resource structure. And so for the ID, we can just hook up the resource ID like so. For the quantity, just copy the local quantity and hook it up. And then we don't need anything for this preferred tool type. Okay. So we have our resources set up. So we should be able to harvest this bush and get some berries from it. Right now, if the local health is less than 0, basically if the bush has no more health, nothing's going to happen. But we should be able to at least, pick a couple of berries from this bush. So let's go ahead and hit play and test this out. So we press E. So we hit a bush. And it looks like we forgot to call the function. So in our character, we created this harvest ground item, but in our event graph, we forgot to actually call this function. So get our harvest ground item function on the graph. So hook it up for the true. So we have this array element. So what we can do is do a get a copy. So get the first bush that we hit here, then just hook that up for the ref. So compile, save that. So now let's go ahead and play test this. So run up to this bush and press E. You can see we added 3 berries, 1 berry, 1 tropical leaf, 2 berries, and I believe the health is set to 0 now, so we shouldn't be able to get any more resources from this bush. So you can see we have our berries now, our tropical leaf. So now what we want to do is set up the destructible mesh for this bush so that when it hits 0, it will just fall apart into a couple pieces and then despawn. So let's go ahead and in our blueprints, go to our harvesting system, and in our destructibles, we have our BP destructible harvestable. Right now we have a rock and tree, So we'll need to create a new one for our bush. So just right click this BP destructible harvestable, create a child blueprint class. We'll just name this to BP underscore ground item destruct. And double click and open that up. And this is going to be the same sort of setup as our rock. So we're going to add in the components a geometry collection. And then in the event graph, let's delete everything other than the event begin play. We'll do our spawn actor from class. The class will be that destructible force, same thing that we use in our rock. So look for our BP destruction force. Right click the spawn, transform, split the struct. For the location, we can get actor location, hook that up, and then we'll just do a delay, say 8 seconds, and do a destroy actor. Then we need to go ahead and create a destructible mesh for our bush. So go into our 3D assets, 3D plants. So drag in this S tropical palm, and then we'll go ahead and close our content browser and go in the select mode and change this to the fracture mode. So before we fracture it, we need to add a new geometry collection. So just click the new plus icon right there. And under the meshes, destructible meshes, we'll go ahead and create geometry collection. Then click on the uniform fracture here. And we'll just leave the settings as 20 and click fracture. And we can see how much it will explode it. So this should be fine. And make sure you set that back to 0 before you exit the fracture mode. Then we should be good. We can delete that. Save it. And now in our ground item destructible, select the geometry collection. And in this rest collection, we can click the drop down and select our S palm geometry collection. Okay, so save that. So now we have our ground item destructible class. Let's create a child of this. So in our harvesting destructibles, right click, create child blueprint, name this to BP underscore tropical bush 01 underscore 01 destructible. Create a new folder and name this bushes. And go ahead and move this into that folder. So now we can set this in our data table. So go to our DT ground resources, and in the class we can set it to that BP tropical bush 01 destructible. So save that. So now we set up the destructible class and we set it in our data table. So now we need to go back to our first person character and go to our harvest ground item. So when this bush, when the health is less than or equal to 0, off of this true, we want to go ahead and spawn that destructible class. So off of the true, we want to get the data table row. So what we can do is just copy all these and paste it up here. Hook this up for the true. And for the get class, we can hook that up for the ref. So we get the class and convert it to a name. Then off of the out row, we can do a break s large item. Want to go ahead and promote this class to a local variable in this local destructible class, and hook that up for the row found. Then we want to get our ground item reference off the ref here and do a is valid question mark is valid check. So we just want to check and see if it's valid here before we do anything. And then we can also, off of the ref here, get actor transform. So we can get the location. Then promote that to a local variable, name that to a local transform. Hook that up for the is valid. And then we can actually go ahead and destroy the bush. So drag off the ref here and do a destroy actor. And then we can go ahead and do a spawn actor from class. So for our class, we're going to hook up our local destructible class. For our transform, we'll hook up our local transform. And just compile, save that. And we should be good to go. Okay. So basically we're checking to see if the health is less than or equal to 0. If it is, that means that the bush can no longer be harvested for resources. And so we'll go ahead and get the class, check and see if this is valid, get the location, destroy it, and then spawn the destructible class. Okay. So if you set this all right, and you also set the destructible class here in the data table, we should be able to see this all in action. Let's go ahead and press E. 1, 2, 3. So you can see it exploded into 1,000 pieces. And we're also glitching on the mesh there, so we can go ahead and fix that. So in our ground item destructible, select the geometry collection and scroll down to the collisions. So just for the pawn, just set this to overlap, that way we don't glitch when we harvest it. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out again. Let's go ahead and pick this a couple times. So it kind of looked like it just fell down there. I'm not sure why it's having some trouble exploding there. Let's go ahead and in our geometry collection, clustering, damage threshold, let's go ahead and modify these values. So let's set this to 5,500 and 50. So it takes less damage for it to explode. Let's test this out. Okay, so it looks a lot better, just falls kind of apart. And then it will just despawn. So the very last thing that I want to add is a little harvesting animation, because right now we're just walking up to the bush and we're pressing E and there's no visual indication that we're picking the bush for berries. So in our BP first person character, let's go back to our event graph here, and what we'll do is we'll play a little animation montage. That way you can show that we're picking the little bush. Let's move this interact up a little bit and just select everything and move it all the way up. And then down here we can right click and add custom event. Name is to harvest montage and set this to run on server. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a little variable like a boolean to check and see if we're already harvesting. That way we can't just spam it multiple times and harvest the bush in a couple seconds. So add a new variable and name this to is harvesting ? And drag this on the graph. Off of here to a branch. And then for the false, we set the is harvesting to true. So if we are harvesting, we don't want to do anything. If we aren't harvesting, we want to set this to true. And then we want to get our third person mesh and do a play montage. So this will play it on the server. And what we're going to do is after it's done playing, we're going to set this to false so that we can harvest again. But we'll also need to play this montage, multicast it, as well as play it on the client so that we can see it in third person and first person. Because if we do this on the server is only going to be able to see that. So technically no one's going to be able to see this happening. So the montage that we need to play is in our man animations. We have this pickup animation. So right click, create Animontage. So just a very simple pickup. And again, this animation was mainly just made for first person. So unfortunately, the arm is just in this A pose. So we're actually going to use it for third person as well. So it's not the greatest animation. It'd be better if the arm was down at the player's side. But this will work for now. So on our character, we'll set our montage to play to our pickup montage. And then off of this execution, what we want to do is do a montage on client. So this is an event inside of this class to play a first person montage. So for the montage, we'll select our pickup montage. So we're doing it on the server and then on the client. Then on completed here, we want to set our is harvesting to false. And then we also want to do a multicast, montage multicast. So off of here we can do a montage multicast and set this to our pickup montage. Okay. So compile, save that, and then we just have to call this harvest montage right after this harvest ground item. So do a harvest montage. And so now we should be able to test this out. So I can run up to this bush. So now you can see I'm playing the animation on first person. It looks like it stopped there after the first time. So I believe this is harvesting. It's not getting set properly. So what we can do is copy this. And when we do our montage multicast, so if we go to that, off of this on completed, we can, off of this and not valid, hook this up, just set that to false. Because if we don't have like a third person item equipped, that means that we're playing a montage for our harvesting animation. So let's go ahead and test that out. So now we can play the montage multiple times and it resets that little Boolean value. So again, it would be better if we had a little better animation, but this one will do for now. So now we can harvest berries in our inventory. We set up our bush as well as our rock and palm tree. In our next couple lectures, we're going to implement item stacking, because right now when we collect resources, it adds all the items to our inventory in separate stacks. And so what we want it to do is we want it to stack all the different items if they are the same item inside of our inventory. Then we're also going to update our animation blueprint a little bit so that we can blend our animation montages with our walk / idle / run animation. That way when we hit a pickaxe, our character's legs will actually move and not just freeze. Okay. So with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next lecture.